a book talk with our incredible president and founder, Dr. Georgette Bennett. We will dive deeply tonight into her newest book, Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence. And I'm honored to be welcoming you here and to welcome also our partners who are joining us for this event. So I'd particularly like to acknowledge the Muslim Community Network, the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, the Interfaith Center of New York, the New York Board of Rabbis, the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, the New York City Office of Faith-Based and Community Partnerships, and of course, our gracious host this evening, Father Andreas and the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine. We are honored to be here with you tonight. At Tanenbaum, we begin our events with what is known as a land acknowledgement. It's an intentional naming of the space in which we live and work. And it's part of a broader effort to decolonize our gathering spaces. This evening in New York City, we find ourselves gathering on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape Nation, and we pay respect to those elders, past and present, who care for this region. And we'd like to take a moment of silence in acknowledgement of the lands and ancestors where we all currently reside, and ask that those ancestors look favorably upon this gathering. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn this over to the Reverend Protopresbyter of the Ecumenical Throne, Father Nicolas Kazarian.
Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros of America. Since 2019, His Eminence has been leading the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, eparchy of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In addition to being a spiritual leader respected globally, a recognized academic, an advocate for social and racial justice, a committed partner in the fight against anti-Semitism, a peace builder, and a true agent of reconciliation, His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros is first and foremost the person of dialogue who values the importance of encountering the other. Tonight's event is proof of his concerns and commitment to enhance interfaith relations as a means to build peace on the firm foundation of shared respect and common understanding. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros to the pulpit.
Thank you, Father Nicholas. Dear friend, Dr. Georgette Bennett, Reverend Father Mark Fowler, beloved sisters and brothers, it is a distinct privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the St. Nicholas National Shrine, a close friend and collaborator of our church, Dr. Georgette Bennett, and so many of our ecumenical and interfaith friends and partners. I am also very grateful to Reverend Mark Fowler, the CEO of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, for approaching us with this unique project. We are here for the presentation of her new book, which she authored with Jerry White, with the title Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence. In all of New York City, I cannot think of a more appropriate setting for understanding this insightful neologism, religicide. For it was here at ground zero that we witnessed how religion is weaponized for the destruction of others, thus leading to the destruction of religion, to which this book so eloquently speaks. Every person who died on 9/11 was a spiritual being, as well as a sentient one. Whether we name that quality soul, spirit, Atman, or Anatman, as human beings, we are designed to recognize in one another the capacity for the divine, that we are all capax Dei. When this recognition disappears, the human person who is so capable of beauty, goodness, mercy, and generosity becomes equally capable of the most cruel and destructive evil. Throughout the march of human history, the weaponization of religion and the weaponization against religion have been dual plagues that have inflicted incalculable suffering on our human family. And even now, when our exploration of space has led us to understand that we all have to live together on this big blue marble, we still see the kind of intolerance and prejudice that leads to destruction. It is as if we have learned nothing, especially after the horrors of the 20th century. That is why Dr. Bennett's message is so important for us today, and so important in this place, where a religious house of worship was destroyed, along with so many living images of God, and why it had to be resurrected to restore all that we are able to, because we each have a duty. We have a responsibility to leave our world better than we found it. A truth known to the ancient Greeks and immortalized in the ephebic oath of Athens, where it stands, and I read directly the English translation of that: "I shall not leave my city any less, but rather greater than I found it." This is very much the mission of the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine at the rebuild of World Trade Center, to give to our city and to our world a better future than we found. Finally, allow me to express the profound thanks of all of us to Dr. Bennett for her lifelong commitment to raising the consciousness of the human family. Her work, the work of the late Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum, the work of his friend and my predecessor, the ever-memorable Archbishop Iakovos, this is the current in which we all must swim. For it is the movement of the human family toward peace, toward mutual trust, and toward mutual understanding, and ultimately toward love. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. You are always most welcome to this place. Thank you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros of America, and with the parish of St. Nicholas, I'm delighted to welcome you all this afternoon to our St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church and National Shrine. I now serve both as the Archiepiscopal Vicar and presiding priest. The dual role reflects the fact that the shrine and the parish occupy the same space but have different missions. As a parish, we serve the Greek Orthodox community of Lower Manhattan, a presence that has been here since the turn of the 20th century. As a shrine for the nation, the meaning of St. Nicholas extends far beyond the local Greek Orthodox community and expands from ground zero, all the implications around 9/11, and the very best of religious faith and respect of all people. The original St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church was built in 1916 and was located on 15 Cedar Street, a block away from the World Trade Center. The original church was just across from the docks where immigrants would disembark and come and light a candle at St. Nicholas to thank God for their safe passage across the Atlantic Ocean. The church was destroyed on September 11th, 2001, when the South Tower collapsed. Welcoming you all to our finished shrine is a very emotional moment for me, personally, and for the community of persons who have worked through the decades to make the dream of the rebuilt St. Nicholas a reality. We have felt a tremendous responsibility to connect the resurrected church community to the World Trade Center site and its immediate history. You can feel the weaving of narratives together, the martyred innocents of 9/11 and the martyred little church. This story of this building itself reflects the themes of religious violence, extremism, politics we will hear about in tonight's discussion, and which our collaborators at the Tanenbaum Center work diligently every day to overcome. Thank you all for your efforts, and thank you for coming. We welcome you, and we hope that you have an enjoyable afternoon.
And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our president and founder, Dr. Georgette Bennett. I do not have the time to go through her entire vita, but she is an award-winning sociologist, a widely published author, a popular lecturer, and former broadcast journalist. An innovative and entrepreneurial leader, she is an active philanthropist focusing on conflict resolution and intergroup relations. In 2013, Dr. Bennett founded the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees and has since worked to raise awareness and mobilize over $400 million of humanitarian aid on behalf of more than 3 million Syrian war victims. This evening, she will be discussing her new book, co-authored with Nobel Peace Prize co-recipient Jerry Wright, titled Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence. Beyond calling attention to this escalating human crisis, this book provides an action plan to reverse religicide with an integrated top-down, bottom-up, and middle-out approach, relying on collaboration among diverse faith groups, international organizations, public officials, businesses, and community leaders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Georgette Bennett.
Well, you got the whole book now. I don't have to say anything. But I do have to say something, and that is I want to thank you, Your Eminence, and esteemed clergy for your very, very warm welcome here. It is so meaningful to be in this shrine, which is a testament to human resilience. And thank you for mentioning the long history of our work together with the Greek Orthodox Church. And thank you to all the partners, and especially to Mark and the staff at the Tanenbaum Center for organizing this wonderful and, for me, very meaningful afternoon. Well, I would bet that you've probably never heard the term religicide, and yet it describes the fastest growing type of violence in the world. So today I'm going to explain what it is, where it's happening, and why its perpetrators are getting away with murder in plain sight, and how to stop it. So I want to open with a story about a 16-year-old Yazidi woman. Some of you have heard this story. I'll call her Sipan. She was married and 2 months pregnant when she was enslaved, raped, and beaten by ISIS fighters who raided her village. She and her husband, along with tens of thousands of other Yazidis, were driven up Mount Singar and left there to starve. And with no food and no water, or no shelter from the sun, they had no choice but to come back down, and that's when they got caught up in the nightmare, the genocide that was perpetrated by ISIS. Now, Sipan never heard from her husband again. In all likelihood, he was killed by ISIS, as were thousands of other Yazidi men. And after being kicked and beaten, she herself was thrown into the trunk of a car and spirited away to Syria. The beatings cost her the child that she was carrying at the time. Now, Sipan was one of 7,000 Yazidi women and girls who were driven through markets and offered up for sale. And as she testified, sometimes ISIS fighters would board the bus and they would choose one of us. They would drive around with a speaker saying, "If you haven't yet found yourself an infidel, this is your chance to take one." In the 3 years that she was enslaved, Sipan was bought 4 times, and the last time was by an Iraqi fighter who took her to Mosul to serve as a slave to his family. Now, you would think that at that point, the beatings with his wife and his children there, you would have thought that some mercy would be shown, that the beatings would have stopped, but no, she was still raped, beaten, and starved. And then she became pregnant by her ISIS master. She, along with the remnants of the Yazidi community, was liberated in 2017. And Yazidi religious authorities had decreed that ISIS captivity survivors were to be respected, and they created a special purification ritual in order to reintegrate them into the community. But that did not apply to the illicit children with ISIS fathers. Under Yazidi laws of endogamy, children have to have 2 Yazidi parents in order to be accepted into the community. And with a Muslim father, Sipan's daughter could not be considered Yazidi. So in order to be accepted, she had to give up her 1.5-year-old child to an aid agency. Now, after all the trauma that she had endured, Sipan decided to kill herself. A friend stopped her. But 9 years after ISIS began its genocide, Sipan, along with most of the 400,000 displaced Yazidis, remain homeless and mired in trauma. Sipan may have been one of the fortunate ones. In the book, I write about one 8-year-old girl who was sold 8 times and raped more than 100 times over a period of 14 months. Another was Sipan's age when she escaped after 2 weeks in ISIS captivity. But during that time, her sister was raped, and she decided that the only way that she could avoid that same fate was to make herself ugly. So what did she do? She doused herself in gasoline and set herself on fire. She burned 80% of her body. A harsh and antiquated form of Islam was weaponized against these women to justify their enslavement by the men of ISIS. Rape, of course, has long been used as a weapon of war, including in Syria, but ISIS went even further. They used sexual slavery to wipe out religious identity and solidify their homogeneous caliphate. Now, ironically, the most brutal ISIS fighters were not the ones from dominant Muslim countries. The most brutal ones were the ones who were converts to Islam from liberal democracies like Germany, England, and Australia. The Yazidis are an ancient Kurdish-speaking community, and ISIS justified its religicide against them by a fervent belief that Yazidis were devil worshippers, and as such, they were worthy of death. They and their food were considered unclean, and ISIS fighters believed that Yazidis had to be eradicated, or else, as Muslims, they would have to answer to their own God. But when the late Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, used to say, "When religion turns men into murderers, God weeps," ISIS gave God plenty of reason to weep. The ISIS playbook, which is called the Management of Savagery, foreshadows the Scorched Earth campaign against the Yazidis and gives it religious justification. Leave no survivors, poison wells, destroy homes, rape and enslave women in order to birth Muslim children, kill all Yazidi men, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, burn all evidence of their existence. And as if killing and enslaving Yazidis weren't harmless enough, ISIS, through ecocide, displaced nearly the entire population of the Yazidi ancestral homeland in Shingal. Although the northern villages of Shingal were freed in 2015, Yazidis could not immediately return. ISIS had placed landmines in fields and houses throughout the region. Even as ISIS began losing territory, its fighters eviscerated the landscape by sabotaging and poisoning wells, as well as destroying pumps and stealing cables, generators, and transformers. ISIS scorched and chopped down Yazidi orchards and slaughtered 70% of the animals. In short, ISIS wanted to make it impossible for Yazidis to return to their ancestral lands. Enslaving young boys and youths and training them as militants did more than strengthen ISIS fighting forces. It made Yazidi children a lethal threat to their own community. One Yazidi survivor reported that ISIS fighters asked the men to identify their religion. When the men confirmed that they were Yazidis, the ISIS fighters said that they were infidels and that killing them was lawful and permissible. After being made to hand over their keys, their phones, their whatever they had on them, they were asked whether they were willing to convert. And when they refused, they were executed on the spot. And that's because ISIS deemed them not human and having no right to live. So why does Yazidi pain resonate so deeply for me, a Western Jew, whose life could not be more different than the pastoral life once led by this ancient and obscure religious group? Well, for one thing, we Jews know what it means to be enslaved, to be considered subhuman, to be demonized, to be the victims of violence with a purpose. And ISIS used some of the same techniques as the Nazis. I felt this most keenly as I wandered among the desolate ruins of the Birkenau concentration camp, part of the Auschwitz complex in Poland. This is where my grandparents literally went up in smoke and where my father and other relatives were imprisoned. In fact, most of my family was killed in industrialized death factories like this or shot dead on the street. My parents were among the few who survived these horrors, and I was born in the immediate aftermath. We fled further persecution and came to the US in 1952 as stateless refugees. But even now, 71 years later, I remain riveted by religion and the violence that religion inspires. Was the Holocaust the first modern religicide? It was, after all, an attempt to wipe out an entire people. The Holocaust led to the codification in law of two forms of human rights violations: crimes against humanity and genocide. An earlier law, war crimes, dates back to the 1800s, and in the 1990s, Bosnia contributed ethnic cleansing to our vocabulary of horror. But here's the thing, none of these terms fully define religicide. Religicide is the highly targeted attempt to wipe out an entire religion, its adherents, its habitats and sacred spaces, its entire cultural heritage. It encompasses all four of the human rights violations that I've just mentioned, but it goes beyond them. Now, while the act of religicide against the Yazidis is largely behind us, there are other full-blown religicides happening as we meet today. Against Uyghur Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists in China, against the Rohingya in Myanmar, and arguably earlier religicides were perpetrated by European colonizers against peoples of the Americas, indigenous peoples of the Americas, and Australia. And I can't speak in a Greek Orthodox shrine without acknowledging the persecution of Eastern Orthodox Greeks in Anatolia carried out by the Ottoman Empire during and after World War I. The genocide included massacres, forced deportations, death marches, burnings of Greek villages, forced conversions to Islam, and the destruction of Eastern Orthodox cultural, historical, and religious monuments. Looking back, sounds a lot like religicide to me, and like so many others, rape figured prominently in its implementation. In China, the Communist Party is taking control of Uyghur women's bodies in myriad ways that range from forced birth control in the form of implants, involuntary sterilizations, and pills to a form of state-sponsored rape in which many are forced to give up their faith and marry Han Chinese men. Of course, they're not permitted to pass on their Muslim faith through the Han babies produced in these marriages. One Uyghur woman detained in a Chinese prison testified that she was force-fed pills every day and so was subjected to weekly injections to stop menstruation. Others testified to being repeatedly raped in prison and subject to genital torture and electric prods. Outside of prison, Uyghur women's reproduction is overseen by family planning workers in the villages, and there are very harsh punishments for unauthorized pregnancies. Both the workers and the pregnant women's husbands can be sent to concentration camp for years. And unless removed by a state-approved medical practitioner, gynecologists who take out intrauterine devices, even for medical reasons, are subject to fines and imprisonment. In Myanmar, radical Buddhist monks are perpetrating a religicide against the Muslim population. A 2018 UN report found that these men believe the high birth rate of Rohingya women is a threat to Buddhism. To that end, the military systematically chooses reproductive age women and girls for rape, attacks, mutilation, and yes, even branding. The apparent agenda of the Buddhists is to use gender violence against Muslim women to quash their ability to spread their culture and identity through reproduction. Violence against women, whether in China, Iraq, Myanmar, Africa, Afghanistan, or the Americas, is a tragically familiar tool of those seeking religious and political dominance. Through forced birth control, they reduce birth rates. Through forced marriages, they achieve mandatory conversions. Through rape, terror, shaming, communal rejection, and intergenerational trauma, they use women to eradicate their own people, beliefs, and cultural heritage. But at this point, I'd like to widen the lens and move beyond women. While other forms of violence in the world are decreasing, anti-religious violence is growing fast, And yet, religicide slips between the cracks of our current human rights infrastructure. And in order to end it, we have to first name it. But once we name it, we need to understand how it begins. It begins with hate speech. Hate speech is hard to define, which makes it hard to prosecute without violating laws and norms related to freedom of expression. International laws don't prohibit hate speech. They only forbid incitement that deliberately triggers violence and discrimination. And the criminal justice system can step in only after hate speech turns into a hate crime or mass atrocity. As of now, 33 countries, plus the 47 countries of the Council of Europe, have enacted hate crime legislation. Most of what is ruled illegal in these countries would be considered protected free speech here in the US. But the First Amendment does not protect incitement to violence. You might want to think about that as you hear all the reports about the argument that former President Trump's defense team is going to be using, which is that what was being done was protected speech under the First Amendment. Incitement to violence, as I mentioned, is not considered protected speech. And although the US has no national hate speech statutes, 47 out of 50 US states have enacted hate crime legislation. And yet, hate speech is precisely the point at which we need to intervene in order to prevent religicide. There's a clear link between verbal violence and physical violence, and it starts with dehumanizing the other with words. Swine, kike, nigger, towelhead, parasite, fag. Words that empty others of their humanity and reduce them to caricatures filled with contempt. That kind of psychic numbing makes it easy to swing that hate-filled caricature from a lynching tree, to shove them into the fires of a Nazi oven, or to shoot them at prayer in a mosque in New Zealand or in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. The core precepts of each of the great religions are rooted in love, peace, and respect. You heard His Eminence talk about that. But ironically, it's in religion that one also finds the roots of hate speech. That's because of group narcissism. The idea that one's own group holds a monopoly on truth. It's grounded in apocalyptic thinking that divides the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. By virtue of being Black, foreign, Jewish, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Muslim, liberal, or LGBTQ, a person can be branded as impure and therefore game for bigoted scourges. Now, American history is replete with linkages between moral fervor and physical violence, from the pious Puritans who burnt their witches to the Ku Klux Klan who burned their crosses, to the neo-Nazis who march in Charlottesville proclaiming Jews will not replace us. And world history gives us many more examples. Just look at the genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, genocides that began with leaders spewing hate speech. There are hundreds of intertwined laws, resolutions, declarations, and mandates designed to protect our right to believe what we want, how we want, where we want, and with whom we want, including the 30 articles of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. Yet almost all of these rights are violated on a daily basis. That's because declarations, unlike conventions and treaties, are not legally binding. And even though conventions and treaties are legally binding, they often can't be enforced. Now, aspects of religicide are covered by these acts, but we're pushing for a new category of human rights abuse because there's nothing that completely covers it. So let me give a few examples of where religicide slips between the cracks. In the 1960s, the UN General Assembly debated race and religion, even though both were already supposedly covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And at the time, many countries in the global South and the West wanted an international framework to end anti-religious violence and extremism. But geopolitics got in the way. What a surprise. Communist states had very little appetite for advancing religious freedom and preferred to highlight systematic racism in the West. In 1981, the General Assembly finally ratified a watered-down version which eliminated intolerance based on religion or belief, but it was enacted as a declaration. So like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it lacks the force of law. In 1967, there was a debate about whether incitement to hatred should be subject to punishment. And in the end, it was left to governments to prevent and end discrimination. But by making it a local decision, it was naively assumed that countries would police themselves. Well, international human rights law and the UN statutes are directed at states, but what about non-state actors like ISIS? ISIS perpetrated a horrific religicide against the Yazidis in Iraq, yet there's nothing in the existing statutes that brings ISIS to justice. In cases like that, we're dependent on states to act, some of which are failed, some of which are autocratic, and some of which lack legitimacy. Facticide, which includes hate speech, disinformation, and incitement, is a key feature of religicide. And under Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states are obligated to forbid any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. That's a quote. But states aren't obligated to move about against these kinds of expression. Ironically, when statutes are used to criminalize incitement, they're often aimed at civil society human rights activists rather than the perpetrators of the violence. Just look at China's crackdown in Hong Kong. And in criminalizing and prosecuting incitement to violence against religious groups, we run into even more gaps in international law and find more roadblocks in bringing the perpetrators to justice. Human rights law specifies the legal duties of states, but the International Criminal Court tries persons, not states, not organizations, not groups. Now that might cover Vladimir Putin as an individual, but what about Syria, China, or Iran as rogue states? What do we do with ISIS? According to the Nuremberg Principle, following orders doesn't absolve individuals of responsibility for human rights crime. But there are two contravening exceptions. First, the perpetrator was under a legal obligation to obey. Second, the perpetrator didn't know that the order was unlawful. Well, what's the definition of a legal obligation? What's the definition of unlawful? Can official government policy be unlawful? The actions of Nazis were completely lawful under German law, as are the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and China's laws. Now, I mentioned earlier that destruction of cultural heritage is a feature of religicide. And there's actually a Hague Convention that covers that in the event of armed conflict, but there's a catch. Cultural property must be registered and marked with specific emblem for protection. Now that's great for large cultural landmarks that are recognized as World Heritage Sites. That's great for this wonderful shrine, which I hope will get that kind of recognition. But it ignores sacred lands, rivers, and mountains, such as the Yazidi home in Shingal, And what about smaller sites, cemeteries, and articles of religious custom and practice? What about scriptures and sacred books? What about attacks on libraries? In one book by Richard Ovenden, he says the attacks on libraries and archives were a cultural assault in its broadest sense. It was not merely the religion of the Jews that the Nazi machine sought to eradicate, but all aspects of Jewish existence, from living beings to the gravestones of their ancestors. And as I said before, this convention applies in the event of armed conflict. But most regicides are not armed conflicts. It's one religion that is attacking another, or it is a state that is attacking a religion, or it is both a state and a religion that's attacking a religion, such as in Myanmar. So we're still left with this issue of how do you prosecute a non-state actor? But perhaps the biggest obstacle to ending religicide is the UN Security Council itself. Each permanent member on the Security Council has the right to veto any action that's brought before the Council. And all actions have to be unanimously approved. But when two of the greatest human rights violators in the world are permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia, what do? The Security Council is crippled, and it has been crippled. And that's one of the reasons that these crimes just go on and nothing is done to intervene. Now, given all of these gaps and obstacles in international bodies and laws, we need to turn to civil society, business, grassroots organizations, and religious leaders. Religious leaders like you, Your Eminence, and your predecessors, and so many of the religious leaders with which the Tanenbaum Center works and our partner organizations. In Myanmar, for example, as I mentioned before, the religicide being perpetrated against the Rohingya is being led by radical Buddhist monks. Well, when Buddhist monks are perpetrating a religicide, we need for Buddhist monks all over the world, along with other religious leaders, to stand up and to say, this is not what Buddhism is about. This is not what religion is about. Faith leaders also have an important obligation to interpret the toxic texts that are often used to justify religicide. All of the great religions have within them texts that have the potential to incite violence. But generally, those texts have emerged in a particular historical context, which needs to be understood in order to grasp what those texts are really about, because it is so easy to misunderstand them and to use them to justify violence. There are other things that religious leaders can do. They can provide sanctuary and houses of worship and use their convening power and moral persuasion to organize coalitions. When religious leaders enter into a global covenant to oppose religicide, they bring their moral authority to bear, their collective moral authority. And although Britain and Western Europe have become more and more secular, the fact is that 84% of the world's population still identifies with religion. And given that high birth rates are on their side, we can't rule out the importance of religious leaders. 20th century interstate diplomatic tools are failing to stop intrastate atrocities in the 21st century. And that's because the current international system is centered on protecting nation-state sovereignty at the expense of human rights. And humanitarian and human rights law favors the protection of individual rights over collective or group rights. So we need a renewed focus on our shared human responsibility. And who is better to bear this responsibility than people of faith, people who share the universal values of compassion, equity, and dignity, can unite in a powerful voice calling for an end to religicide. And their ties to each other are less a treaty and more of a covenant. And covenants are ties that bind. I would love to give you some examples of religious leaders and what they have done in order to end conflicts, because the Tanenbaum Center has a program, it's one of our signature programs, called Peacemakers in Action, which has a network of religiously motivated peacemakers who operate at the grassroots in conflict zones throughout the world. And I had a whole long story about one of them to give you an example. But I think if I go into those stories, I will be making too much of a claim on your attention. So let me start to wind down this sometimes harangue that I have been giving you. But I'm passionate about this stuff. You may have noticed. Religious leaders are part of a top-down, middle-out, bottom-up approach that we outline in our Religicide book, and which Mark mentioned in his very kind introduction. And you'd get very tired of hearing me speak if I went through all the ways in which we can mobilize against religicide. In fact, you may already be tired of hearing me speak, so I'll just throw out a few nuggets. The full program is in our book, which is back there. 1, governments can admit more religicide refugees and provide much more aid to restore survivors in their communities. Global business leaders can alter their supply chains so as not to support perpetrators of religicide. For example, Apple no longer buying supplies that are made by Uyghur slaves. Where religicide pits the state against a religion, diplomats have to use economic and political pressure to deter inhumane behavior. Set up early warning systems. This is absolutely critical. Early warning systems to detect weaponized language as a prelude to violence. And there's been a lot of research done on how one can use language as a predictor of violence. Take a public health approach. Like the spread of a disease, violence can be stopped with early intervention and a public health approach to interrupt and reduce violence. Above all, advocates and survivors of religicide must have their voices heard. Rehumanizing the dehumanized victims of religicide is a big step in preventing further atrocities. That means hearing the voices of the survivors and calling nations to account. At the grassroots level, it also means eschewing name, blame, shame attacks, and instead engaging with the perpetrators. Hating your enemy may feel good, and it may feel righteous, but it's not going to solve the problem. You have to do counter-messaging that's based on sound social psychological principles, some of which are intuited by religious leaders as an important part of putting an end to religicide. And there's also been a lot of research on that, on what kind of counter-messaging works. Finally, it's important to look at all regicides as a group rather than allowing perpetrators to divide and conquer. Regicide must be dealt with as a global issue with a global response. Now, perhaps this latter part of my talk has been a bit technical, so I'd like to end this talk where I began, with a heartfelt cry from a Yazidi woman. She is Nobel Prize winner Nadia Murad. We must do more than merely endure. We must work toward a future in which the entire world, not just Yazidis, says never again. Thank you. Sure.
Testing 1, 2. Can you hear me? Yes. Great, thank you.
This is a role reversal, Mark. I used to interview you.
I know. And since I still...
You were a great hire.
I like to think so. Well, since I've still got my job, I actually want to hear, and I could listen to you talk all day, but I would really love to hear a couple of those stories that you generously edited from your formal remarks.
I really meant to go into them, and then I realized I was running way over.
Well, you know, I'm going to open up the question and answer to everyone here, but I get to ask the first question. So I really would love, I mean, I think that, first of all, the book is amazing. I particularly am moved by the global covenant and the idea that in covenant, in intentional relationship, there is much more that we can accomplish than in just the models that we have now. Given that, which of our peacemakers would you say, or could you talk about one of our peacemakers that you think is an example of the potential of a global covenant?
Well, I think I'd like to focus on a couple of our earliest peacemakers, because those examples are so powerful. Now, granted, none of them were intervening in a regicide, but they were intervening in conflicts in which religion was an element. So let me start with Father Alex Reid and Reverend Roy McGee. They were involved in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And you don't hear very much about them. What you hear about is George Mitchell and Jerry Adams and so on. But the Good Friday Agreement, which put an end to the Troubles, mostly an end to the Troubles, really could not have happened if it were not for Father Alex Reid, who was known as the IRA priest, and Reverend Roy McGee, who was clergy for the loyalist paramilitaries. Now, what each of them did, and what they were able to do as religious leaders, because they had street credentials, was they were able to negotiate a ceasefire. Father Reid with the IRA and Reverend Roy McGee with the paramilitaries. And they were able to negotiate those ceasefires because they had been down there on the ground while the fighting was going on. Alex Reed used to work with the prisoners in Mays, the notorious Mays prison, with all the hunger strikes where the prisoners were trying to renegotiate their status from political prisoners to prisoners of war. And he also was there in the street tending to them when they got injured in the fighting. Tending not only to them, there's a photograph that circulated around the world in which he was administering last rites to a British soldier who had gotten killed in the fighting. And as you know, the British were absolutely the enemy of the IRA. It was the British yoke that they were trying to cast off. The same thing with Reverend McGee. There were militias that were planning to go out in the streets in the Protestant areas, and he knew that this could lead to violence. And he told them to please stay home. He said, "Stay home. I personally will patrol the streets to make sure that you stay safe." So it's because of acts like this that when Reed and McGee said to their respective constituents, "You are in violation of what God wants you to do," they took that very seriously. And so he was able to negotiate these ceasefires. And a very interesting thing happened. I was in Northern Ireland very soon. I was in Belfast very soon after the signing of the Good Friday agreements. And this was a very tough thing for the Irish to accept, because one of the terms of the Good Friday Agreement was the release of political prisoners. Now, by agreeing to release the political prisoners, you were agreeing to the release of the murderers of your loved ones. That's what you were agreeing to. Now imagine what an act of forgiveness it had to take to agree to that referendum, which included that. So after the Good Friday Agreement was approved, I was at a meeting with released political prisoners. On the one side were released IRA prisoners, and on the other side were released loyalist paramilitary prisoners. There they were in a room together. There they were with the murderers of their loved ones. And yet, they were in the forefront of reconciliation. And they became the leaders in their communities. Now, why did they become the leaders? It's because while they were in that notorious Mays prison, negotiating their status as prisoners, they were learning negotiation skills. They were learning leadership skills. And they were able to put these to work after the signing of the Good Friday agreements. Another one?
I dare not. Well, but I think that what's really wonderful and important about what you're bringing up, there are two things that resonate for me. One is the idea that these were religious leaders in action.
Yes.
They were people, they were men, women, they were men who are peacemakers in action, are men and women who are literally constantly working with the community, so that it's not a surprise when someone comes and is able to enact their moral authority and say, is this what you believe you should do?
That's right. They are there before, during, and after the UN peacekeepers.
That's right, that's right. I mean, that was one thing that I thought was really critical. And I think the other thing that you really brought home in the story, because as I understand it, Father Reed and Father McGee and Reverend Reed had never met.
They had never met.
So they were negotiating with the groups that they were most closely connected to. And it's almost as if they were connected in some way, unspoken, to take these acts, never having met one another and not knowing that the other was negotiating. So it's not like, it's not like they were communicating and sending texts back and forth. I just got them to agree to da-da-da. I mean, that they were operating on...
People weren't texting
People
back
weren't
then.
texting then. So, they were operating at quite a high spiritual level to be driven in their own context to work with people where they were. So I could ask lots more questions, but then the people in the audience will get mad. So is there anyone who has a question? Oh, and there's a question right away. Someone is coming right now with the microphone.
Is this working?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Okay. Well, that was absolutely marvelous, Georgette. I mean, really, really marvelous. My question is, when you look across the globe and throughout history, religion is premised on teaching of kindness, mutual respect, love, belief in a deity, some type of destiny, and somehow that gets twisted in the name of religion into hate and power and drive to dominate and to often eradicate in the name of trying to be superior. I think if we could figure out how that twist happens, maybe there's a way to prevent religicide in the future.
Well, I'm going to answer that, Stuart, by repeating something I said during my talk, because I truly believe that this is the root of it all. It's apocalyptic thinking. Because once you start dividing the world into the children of light and the children of darkness, that's where it happens. Once you start believing that your own particular religious truth is the truth, that's where it happens. Because once you do that, it's the start of dehumanization. Everybody else then becomes an infidel. And I think it's as simple and as complicated as that.
And could you also, Georgette, just say a word, because I also heard you say in your presentation, the whole idea of, in our traditions, and particularly in sacred texts and in oral tradition, there is explanation for everything, both that which we have overcome, that which we have suffered, and who it may be still okay to not like a whole lot. So could you just say a little bit about the importance of scriptural reasoning and the importance of holding sacred text in context?
Yes. Let's take the story of Joshua, after which I named my son. The story of Joshua in the Jewish scriptures is very easy to interpret as a genocide, because when Joshua is permitted or commanded to lead the Israelites into the promised land, Moses never gets to go there. For those of you who don't know, Moses has to hang out on Mount Nebo, and that's where he dies. And you may think that's kind of unfair, because after all, he led these people through the desert for 40 years, so why doesn't he finally get to go to the promised land? I don't have the answer. So Joshua goes in his stead, and Joshua is told, if you read that text literally without understanding what it really means, he is told to kill every man, woman, and child, I think even the animals, if I remember correctly, when he enters the promised land. That's not what he is being told to do. What it's really about is the importance of remaining separate so as not to be influenced by what were considered the naughty habits of the people who lived there. It's not literally about killing them. It's about maintaining a kind of purity. But if you just read it without doing that scriptural reasoning dive into it, hey, he's being told to kill everybody. No. We see that in Islam as well, Dar al-Harb and Dar Islam. You know, that you have the world of Islam and everything else is the world of war, and because it's the world of war, then you're justified in killing and doing whatever, anywhere that is not Dar Islam. But that's not what the meaning of it is. That emerged in a specific historical context out of a specific battle that took place, and you need to understand what it meant. So we can find this in all of I mean, look at Matthew. A curse on, I'm having a senior
Ham.
moment.
A curse on Ham?
No, it's not a curse on Ham. It's a curse on the Jews. If it were only Ham, then we wouldn't all be dead over all these centuries. No, it's Matthew about a curse on their blood, and it's basically that the thing that has been interpreted to mean that Jews are an accursed people. It's the teaching of contempt against the Jews, but I'm losing the precise quote, which has been interpreted over the centuries as a mandate to persecute Jews. But that's not what that quote in Matthew is about. What it is about, you should be helping me out with Matthew. Come on, this isn't fair. I've got all this clergy sitting here and nobody's helping me out. And you're supposed to be compassionate and you're supposed to be nice. All right, so what it's really about is not the cursed blood of the Jews, it's about the cleansing blood of Christ, which is a completely different message from go kill all the Jews forever.
That'll do it. Do we have another question?
Is it something I said? Here we go.
We have one up front.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I wonder, as someone who has studied the progression from weaponized speech to violence, to bring it home, where do you see this country in that path? And maybe you can expand and explain to us your understanding of why aren't all the religious leaders daily providing a deluge of stop that because it's not leading in the right place. How do you see that?
I think we are there. I think we are at that nexus of dehumanization leading to violence. We're seeing it all around us. I think it's undeniable. People feel free to act because, again, we have divided our country into the children of light and the children of darkness. Why are not all religious leaders standing up and saying this is wrong? I don't have a full answer for you, but I think it is true that we see some religious some religious institutions, some religious denominations that have become very politicized. And once politics begins to influence religion, that's where religion becomes very corrupt. In another book I wrote a long time ago, a book called Crime Morphs, The Future of Crime in America, I have a chapter in which I deal with an evolution that has taken place on the religious right and in evangelical Christianity, which historically eschewed politics. And in fact, followers of evangelical Christianity were expected to keep their religion very far out of the political sphere, because what they were tasked to do was to focus on their own soul. And if you began to move into the political sphere, that's not what you were doing anymore. So that's just one example, and I don't by any means imply that evangelical Christianity is the only place where we have seen politicization taking place. I'm simply giving that one example of a transformation that has taken place in a part of Christianity that specifically eschewed religion and too much engagement with that world. And we see what some of that has led to.
So, you will be the last question. Hold on one second. The microphone is coming to you.
My very dear friend, Judy Collins.
I was thinking we should break into Amazing Grace, but not right now.
Well, you've got the mic, Judy.
Oh,
You
that
might as
would be a perfect way to end
I'd be
this.
happy
Judy,
to do that.
Amazing Grace.
I'd be overjoyed. But I know, I mean, I feel that I've been subsumed by the questions and the disaster and the pain and the promise that we've heard from you tonight. It's extraordinary. It was an extraordinary expose, in a way. And I'm settled in on one particular issue which I want to talk to you about, because I would like to have, for instance, a list of the United Nations vetoes throughout these past years and how much damage they have done. It seems to me that this organization that we've put so much faith in, the United Nations, I mean, my God, we wanted this to be the answer, to bring all of the countries in the world together, to have a platform, to have a place to go with their issues, and that this veto exists in this powerful place of hope and where we have put so many of our resources, and we know what good the UN does. We know that it solves things. We know that it feeds people. We know that it takes care of but if the veto remains, then all it would seem is lost on these issues that you're talking about and these places. Is it possible to change the power of the veto to do the damage that it does?
Well, of course, changing it would require the permanent members to give up their power.
Yes, indeed.
There is a very cumbersome mechanism which is very, very rarely employed. There is a way that if the Security Council repeatedly does not act on something, on a problem that's put before it, there is a way to kick it over to the General Assembly. But it is extremely difficult to do, and I can't give you any examples of when it has actually been done. But the problem really goes back, the police are coming.
I don't think they're coming for you.
Are you sure?
They're coming
I'm not
for
sure.
me.
So keep talking.
I have a lot of skeletons in my closet. This all goes back, believe it or not, to the Peace of Westphalia. Now, the Peace of Westphalia is a treaty that was enacted in order to supposedly end the religious wars in Europe. Excuse me?
Date.
I was deliberately avoiding the date because I'm very bad at remembering dates. I think it's in the 1600s, but it was probably a century or two before that. Anyway, you
1654.
can Google the date. Just remember Peace of Westphalia. Listen, I'm almost 77 years old. I don't have to remember all those dates anymore. I passed all my exams. Peace of Westphalia was very important because one of the things that it did, the way it put an end to those religious wars, is it privatized religion and made the state sovereign. Now, that certainly created a separation of church and state, and certainly here in America, we would say that's a good thing. But what was bad about it is that it elevated protecting the state above protecting the citizens of that state. And that principle of nation-state sovereignty that began with the Peace of Westphalia is the root of all the problems in the UN. Because the cardinal rule is non-intervention in the internal affairs of a state. And that's one of the reasons that we see so many human rights abuses, and we see so many of these conflicts where we are helpless to intervene. It is the principle of sovereignty. And what we need to do is elevate the responsibility of the state to protect its citizens, and if it does not, to make it much easier to intervene. As international law stands now, the only time you can intervene is if a conflict spills over into another state. In other words, if it goes across a border. As long as it's happening within a state, the principle of sovereignty dominates.